For many years, George Clooney represented something rare in Hollywood. A man who had everything yet claimed to want very little. He was famous, wealthy, admired, and endlessly charming, but he wore his independence like a badge of honor. Long before marriage entered his life again, Clooney made it clear that he did not believe he was built for it. After a short and unhappy marriage in the early 1990s, he publicly declared that marriage was not for him, often joking about it during interviews. As his career grew and his fame expanded across the globe, that stance only seemed to harden. While many of his peers sailed into family life, Clooney traveled, worked nonstop, and filled his world with projects, activism, and friendships. To the public, his bachelor lifestyle looked glamorous and carefree. But behind the image of confidence and humor, there were hints of something quieter. Friends and colleagues occasionally spoke about a sense of loneliness that followed him, a feeling that success could not fully erase. Clooney himself often masked this with sharp wit, becoming the life of every room he entered. Yet when the lights went out and the parties ended, he returned to large, silent homes that reflected both his success and his solitude. This was the version of George Clooney the world knew for decades, a man seemingly content without emotional permanence, convinced that love and commitment came at a cost he was unwilling to pay. Everything changed when Amal Clooney entered his life. Unlike the actresses and models Clooney had dated before, Amal came from an entirely different world. She was a respected international human rights lawyer, deeply involved in global legal work, teaching, and advocacy. She was not interested in Hollywood fame, nor was she impressed by it. That difference alone shifted the balance. Clooney later admitted that he felt something unfamiliar from the very beginning, a sense that control was slipping away from him in the best and most frightening way. Their relationship developed quickly, not because of glamour, but because of mutual respect and curiosity. Clooney found himself adapting, waiting, and even questioning his own worth in ways he never had before. This relationship did not revolve around his fame. It demanded emotional presence, patience, and vulnerability. When he proposed, breaking a vow he had kept for over 20 years, the moment symbolized more than romance. It represented surrender. Marriage was no longer a limitation to him, but a risk worth taking. Their wedding was celebrated around the world as a fairy tale, not only because of their celebrity status, but because it felt like proof that people can change, even late in life. Clooney became a husband and a father, and publicly embraced a quieter, more grounded version of himself. To many, the story felt complete, as if the restless bachelor had finally found peace. But life rarely follows a perfect arc, and even the most beautiful beginnings do not guarantee effortless endings. In the years that followed their marriage, George and Amal Clooney built a life that appeared balanced, meaningful, and deeply purposeful. They shared homes in Europe and the United States, raised their twins away from constant media attention, and committed themselves to causes larger than entertainment. Together, they founded a justice organization that blended Amal's legal expertise with George's public influence. From the outside, their partnership looked strong because it was built on shared values rather than shared industries. George often spoke with admiration about Amal's intelligence and dedication, describing her as someone who made him want to be better. He adjusted his lifestyle, reduced habits that no longer fit his new role, and embraced fatherhood with visible pride. Amal, in turn, continued her demanding career, teaching, arguing cases before international courts, and shaping global conversations around justice and human rights. For a time, their differences complemented each other. His experience and visibility amplified her work, while her discipline and focus grounded his life. They were praised as a modern power couple, not flashy, but serious, intelligent, and principled. The image was not built on perfection, but on balance. However, balance is fragile, especially when two people are driven by powerful ambitions. Over time, the very qualities that brought them together began to pull them in different directions. Amal's work required intense focus, travel, and long stretches of time in academic and legal environments far from Hollywood. George, while supportive, was entering a different phase of life. As he aged, his priorities slowly shifted toward reflection, stability, and legacy. He was no longer chasing fame, but meaning. While Amal's career continued to accelerate, George began to slow down, not out of failure, but out of natural change. This difference did not create conflict in loud or obvious ways. There were no public arguments, no scandals, no dramatic accusations. Instead, the distance grew quietly. Their schedules became harder to align. Their physical presence in the same place became less frequent. Over time, emotional closeness can weaken when daily life is lived apart. Even when love remains, silence replaced discussion, not because of anger, but because both were exhausted and unwilling to add more pressure to an already demanding life. In public, they continue to appear united, composed, and supportive, but privacy often hides complexity. Silence, especially between people who once shared everything, can be heavier than conflict. It allows uncertainty to grow without direction. When couples avoid disagreement to protect peace, they sometimes avoid honesty as well. This does not mean love disappears, but it changes shape, becoming quieter, more cautious, and sometimes fragile. The story of George and Amal Clooney at this stage is not one of collapse, but of tension between growth and togetherness. It reflects a reality many couples face, though few experience it under global scrutiny. Success, purpose, and love do not always move at the same speed. And when they don't, even the strongest relationships must confront difficult questions about presence, sacrifice, and what it truly means to remain connected over time. For many years after that painful first marriage ended, George Clooney built a life that looked full on the outside, but carefully guarded on the inside. He became famous not only for his films, but for his decision to stay single, a choice he repeated so often that it slowly turned into part of his public identity. Interviews were filled with jokes about how marriage was not for him, how he was better alone, and how freedom mattered more than commitment. Audiences laughed, journalists repeated the lines, and the image stuck. George Clooney was Hollywood's most charming bachelor, a man who had everything except a wife, and according to him, that was exactly how he wanted it. Behind that confidence, however, there was a quiet sense of control. His life ran on his schedule, his rules, and his comfort. He traveled when he wanted, worked when he felt inspired, and retreated to his homes in Italy or elsewhere whenever the noise became too loud. Friends admired his independence, but some noticed that his laughter often worked as a shield. The long nights, the parties, and the constant movement helped keep deeper questions at a distance. Commitment required vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. George had already been hurt once, and he was determined not to repeat that experience. His bachelor life became not just a preference, but a form of protection. Then Amal entered his world, and the carefully balanced structure he had built began to shift. She was not impressed by his fame, not interested in Hollywood games, and not available on his timetable. Her life followed a different rhythm, shaped by courtrooms, research, and responsibility rather than red carpets. This difference unsettled him in a way he had never felt before. For the first time in decades, he had to wait, to adjust, and prove himself not as a star, but as a partner. That process slowly broke down his emotional defenses. Love no longer felt like a trap, but like a challenge worth facing. When he proposed and later married Amal, many people saw it as a fairy tale ending, the reformed bachelor finally choosing love. What they did not see was how much internal change that decision required. Marriage forced George to share not just space, but priorities. His time was no longer fully his own. His choices affected someone else who was just as strong, just as driven, and just as unwilling to compromise her core values. At first, that balance felt exciting. They admired each other deeply. George was proud of Amal's intelligence and purpose, and Amal respected George's experience and influence. Together, they looked like equals who had found a shared path. But equality and admiration does not always translate into equality in daily life. As years passed, their responsibilities grew heavier instead of lighter. Children entered the picture, careers expanded, and the space for quiet connection slowly narrowed. George, who once feared being tied down, now feared something else entirely, losing the closeness he had finally allowed himself to feel. The irony was painful. The man who once avoided marriage to protect his freedom now found himself afraid of emotional distance inside the very relationship he had chosen. This fear did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through long separations, busy schedules, and nights spent alone in different cities. There were no dramatic fights, no public scandals, just a gradual sense that something essential was slipping away. For George, who had spent most of his life in control. This loss felt unfamiliar and unsettling. Love had changed him, but it also exposed him to a kind of vulnerability he had never fully learned how to manage. As the years passed, George and Amal Clooney entered a new phase of their marriage, one that was not shaped by public drama or sudden scandal, but by something far more subtle and difficult to fight: distance. This distance did not arrive overnight, nor did it come with raised voices or slammed doors. Instead, it crept in slowly, hidden behind busy schedules, professional pride, and mutual respect. Both George and Amal were deeply committed to their work, and for a long time, that shared ambition was what bonded them. Amal's legal career continued to rise, placing her at the center of historic human rights cases, international courts, and academic leadership. George, meanwhile, remained active in film, activism, and creative projects that demanded his full attention. On the surface, they still appeared united, supportive, and proud of one another. They praised each other in interviews, smiled confidently on red carpets, and spoke about teamwork and family. Yet behind closed doors, the reality of living in two different professional worlds began to quietly reshape their emotional connection. Amal's work increasingly tied her to Europe, particularly England, where her teaching role and legal responsibilities required long-term focus and physical presence. George, on the other hand, found himself spending more time in the United States, drawn toward creative ambitions that had been waiting for years. The time apart was not a choice made out of conflict, but necessity. Still, necessity does not soften the emotional cost of absence. Long flights replaced shared mornings. Phone calls replaced quiet dinners. Text messages replaced real conversations. Over time, these substitutions, though practical, became insufficient. Being supported from afar is very different from feeling truly connected. The couple adjusted as best they could, telling themselves this phase was temporary, that love was strong enough to endure separation. But even strong love can weaken when everyday intimacy disappears. Moments that once brought closeness, like sharing daily routines or spontaneous laughter, became rare. Instead, conversations slowly shifted toward logistics: schedules, children, commitments, and responsibilities. Emotional depth was not lost intentionally. It was postponed, always waiting for a better time that never seemed to arrive. For George, this shift was especially difficult. After years of independence, he had finally built a family life that gave him peace and meaning. Being away from that life, even for valid reasons, felt like losing something precious. He missed the noise of home, the unpredictable energy of children, and the comfort of shared silence with someone who truly knew him. Amal, meanwhile, carried her own weight. Balancing motherhood with a demanding global career required intense discipline. Her days were structured, focused, and mentally exhausting. Though she cared deeply for George, her emotional energy was often consumed by responsibilities that could not be delayed or ignored. Neither of them was wrong. Neither was selfish. Yet both were slowly drifting into separate emotional spaces shaped by duty rather than desire. Friends close to the couple noticed a change, not through arguments or public tension, but through what was missing. The warmth was quieter. The spontaneity was gone. The sense of us against the world had softened into parallel lives moving side by side, but rarely intersecting. This kind of distance is often the most dangerous because it does not announce itself. There is no clear moment to point to, no single event to blame. Instead, it builds quietly, layer by layer, until one day both people realize they feel alone even while still connected by marriage. For George and Amal, this realization did not lead to dramatic confrontation. It led to reflection, silence, and unanswered questions. Could love survive without shared presence? Could commitment remain strong when daily connection fades? These questions had no easy answers, and the uncertainty surrounding them marked the beginning of the most challenging chapter of their relationship. As the years passed after their wedding, George and Amal Clooney slowly settled into a life that many people around the world admired and even envied. From the outside, their marriage looked calm, intelligent, and full of purpose. They were not a loud celebrity couple chasing attention. Instead, they appeared thoughtful and mature, always speaking kindly about each other in interviews. George often said that Amal made him a better man, while Amal described George as supportive and generous with his time and love. When their twins, Ella and Alexander, were born in 2017, this image of perfection became even stronger. George spoke openly about how fatherhood changed him, saying that becoming a parent gave his life deeper meaning than fame ever could. He joked about learning how to change diapers and staying up late at night, but behind the humor was genuine pride and joy. Amal, meanwhile, continued her demanding legal work while also embracing motherhood, proving to many women that it was possible to balance a powerful career and family life, even if it required sacrifice. Together, they chose to raise their children largely away from Hollywood, preferring homes in England, France, and Italy, where life felt slower and more private. Their shared commitment to human rights through the Clooney Foundation for Justice also became a central part of their marriage. It was not just a charity, but a shared mission that connected George's global influence with Amal's legal expertise. For a long time, this shared purpose helped bridge the differences between their worlds. However, beneath this calm surface, the realities of time, distance, and personal ambition quietly began to test their bond. Amal's career continued to grow at a rapid pace, taking her to courtrooms, universities, and global conferences around the world. She accepted a prestigious teaching position at Oxford University, a role that demanded focus, discipline, and physical presence in England. George, on the other hand, reached a stage in life where reflection became as important as ambition. In his 60s, he began thinking more about legacy, aging, and a desire for stability after decades of constant movement. While he still loved acting and filmmaking, his pace naturally slowed compared to Amal's rising professional momentum. This difference did not come from conflict or resentment, but from two people moving at different speeds in life. At first, they managed this imbalance with understanding and respect. They supported each other's schedules and celebrated each other's successes. But as time passed, the physical distance between them increased, and so did the emotional strain. Living in different countries for long periods made simple moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, and everyday routines harder to maintain. Phone calls and video chats helped, but they could not fully replace presence. Slowly, without loud arguments or dramatic confrontations, a sense of emotional distance began to appear. It was a kind of distance that grows quietly, unnoticed at first, until it becomes impossible to ignore. For a couple known for their harmony and mutual respect, this silence was more unsettling than open conflict. Friends close to them noticed that while George and Amal remained deeply respectful toward each other, something had shifted. The warmth was still there, but it was now mixed with fatigue. Their marriage was no longer just about love, but about endurance, about holding on while life pulled them in different directions. This stage of their relationship did not signal an ending, but it marked the beginning of a difficult chapter, one defined not by scandal or betrayal, but by the quiet challenge of staying connected while growing apart. For most of his adult life, George Clooney was known not just as a famous actor, but as a man who had quietly closed the door on love. After a short and unhappy marriage in the early 1990s, he publicly decided that marriage was not for him. This was not a careless joke or a passing phase. It became part of his identity. In interviews, George often laughed about being bad at marriage, turning personal disappointment into humor that audiences found charming and honest. As his career grew, so did his belief that independence was safer than emotional commitment. Fame gave him everything except the one thing he no longer trusted: lasting partnership. While other Hollywood stars built families, George chose a different path. He traveled constantly, worked on intense film projects, and surrounded himself with friends, laughter, and late nights. From the outside, his life looked full and exciting. But behind the public image of the confident bachelor was a man who had learned to protect himself from disappointment by avoiding deep emotional risk. George's bachelor life was not lonely in a dramatic way. It was structured, controlled, and familiar. He owned beautiful homes, including his famous villa in Italy, and enjoyed a lifestyle that allowed him to move freely without answering to anyone. This freedom suited him, especially after his painful divorce. Over time, he convinced himself that love was something best admired from a distance. He often said that he was happier this way, and for a long time people believed him. Yet those closest to him noticed something quieter and harder to explain. There was a sense that his life, while successful, lacked emotional depth. The parties ended, the guests left, and the silence returned. Humor covered that silence well, but it did not erase it. George himself admitted years later that fame and work could distract him, but they could not fully replace human connection as the years passed. His refusal to marry again became almost legendary. He even made public bets with friends that he would never walk down the aisle. These statements were not acts of arrogance, but shields built from past hurt. George had decided that protecting his peace meant avoiding vulnerability. Love, to him, had become a risk he was no longer willing to take. And yet, beneath that certainty was a man who still admired strong, intelligent people and meaningful conversations. He respected ambition, discipline, and purpose. He just did not believe those things could coexist peacefully with marriage in his own life. This is why the arrival of Amal Clooney would later feel so shocking, not only to the public but to George himself. She entered his life at a moment when he believed his story was already written. He was over 50, comfortable in his routines, and convinced that the idea of forever belonged to another chapter he had already closed. What he did not expect was that love would return quietly, without drama, and challenge everything he thought he understood about control, independence, and emotional safety. Before Amal, George Clooney believed love was behind him. After her, he would discover that love, once reopened, demands not just passion, but endurance, patience, and the courage to change. Even when change becomes painful as the years pass, the marriage between George and Amal Clooney entered a phase that many long-term couples quietly experience but rarely talk about. A phase where love still exists, but time, distance, and personal ambition begin to test its strength. By the mid-2020s, both George and Amal were at powerful but very different stages of their lives. Amal was deeply involved in international law, teaching at Oxford University, advising governments, and working on cases that carried enormous moral weight. Her days were structured, demanding, and intellectually intense, often planned months in advance. George, on the other hand, was entering a reflective stage of his career. While still active and respected, he was increasingly drawn to meaningful projects rather than constant public attention. His decision to pursue a Broadway adaptation of Goodnight and Good Luck was not about fame, but about legacy, craft, and personal fulfillment. This difference in rhythm slowly created a physical and emotional gap. Amal spent long stretches in England with the children, while George divided his time between New York, Los Angeles, and Europe. They were no longer just traveling for work. They were living in different worlds. Friends close to the couple noted that there was no dramatic fight, no betrayal, and no sudden collapse. Instead, there was silence, a silence created by busy schedules, exhaustion, and the quiet assumption that love would always be able to wait. Phone calls became shorter, focused on logistics rather than emotions. Conversations centered around the children, upcoming travel, and professional responsibilities. The deeper questions, the ones about feelings, fears, and personal struggles, were often postponed for later, a later that never seemed to arrive. George, who once joked about avoiding marriage to protect his freedom, now found himself missing the simple noise of family life, the sound of children running through the house, and the calm presence of his wife after a long day. Amal, meanwhile, carried the pressure of responsibility not just as a wife and mother, but as a global legal figure whose work affected real lives. Neither was wrong. Neither had failed. They were simply being pulled in different directions by the very qualities that once made their partnership so powerful. The age difference, something they had handled with grace for years, also began to feel more noticeable, not emotionally, but practically. George was thinking more about balance, health, and slowing down. Amal was still accelerating, building, teaching, and fighting complex legal battles. This contrast did not create resentment, but it did create imbalance. George admired Amal deeply, yet sometimes felt left behind by her momentum. Amal respected George's achievements, yet needed structure and reliability in a life already filled with chaos from global issues. The public continued to see smiling photographs, elegant appearances, and supportive words in interviews, but behind those images was a couple navigating a difficult truth. Love does not disappear when life becomes complicated, but it does require constant care. When that care is delayed too long, distance grows quietly without warning signs. This stage of their marriage was not about endings, but about uncertainty, about two people trying to understand whether they could adjust their lives once again to meet in the middle, as they had done years before. The question was no longer whether they loved each other, but whether love alone was enough to overcome time, ambition, and the quiet weight of growing older in separate rhythms. George Clooney has spent most of his life under bright and unforgiving light of fame, yet for decades he appeared perfectly comfortable standing alone. To the public, he was a charming bachelor who seemed immune to loneliness, a man who laughed off questions about marriage and treated commitment like a joke rather than a goal. After his short and unhappy marriage in the early 1990s, Clooney openly admitted that he believed marriage was simply not for him. He often said he was not good at it, turning his doubts into humor during interviews and talk show appearances. As his career grew and his face became one of the most recognizable in Hollywood, this image of independence became part of his legend. He was not just single, he was proudly single. While many of his peers built families and settled into quieter lives, Clooney filled his time with films, activism, travel, and long nights with friends. To millions watching from the outside, his life looked full, exciting, and free. Yet beneath that polished surface, those closest to him sensed something more complicated. Fame gave him applause, wealth gave him comfort, but neither could fully replace the feeling of having someone who truly shared his private world. That quiet emptiness never appeared in photographs, but it lingered in the background of his carefully controlled life. Everything began to change when Amal Clooney entered his world, not as a fan or admirer, but as an equal who stood firmly in her own identity. She was not shaped by Hollywood, nor impressed by it. As an accomplished human rights lawyer with a demanding international career, Amal represented something entirely new to Clooney. For the first time, he was not the most important or powerful person in the room, and that reality both challenged and attracted him. Their relationship developed slowly, built on conversation, respect, and shared curiosity about the world. Clooney himself later admitted that he had never expected someone like Amal to choose him. That sense of disbelief stayed with him even as their bond grew stronger. When he eventually decided to propose, it marked a dramatic shift in how he saw himself. The man who once rejected marriage now wanted permanence, stability, and partnership. Their wedding in Venice was celebrated as a modern fairy tale, a symbol that even the most devoted bachelor could change when he met the right person. For a time, that story felt true. Clooney appeared calmer, more grounded, and deeply proud of the life he had built with Amal. As the years passed, their marriage seemed to reflect balance rather than sacrifice. They supported each other's ambitions, raised their twins away from constant attention, and worked together on humanitarian projects that blended fame with purpose. To the public, they looked like a rare example of success in a world where celebrity relationships often collapse under pressure. However, marriage is not only tested by love, it is tested by time, distance, and the natural changes that come with aging and ambition. As both George and Amal continued to grow in their careers, their lives became increasingly complex. Amal's work demanded intense focus, long hours, and travel across continents. George, while still active and creative, began to feel the weight of years in an industry that values youth and momentum. These differences did not create loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they created something quieter and more dangerous, emotional distance. The kind of distance that does not announce itself but slowly settles into everyday life. In many ways, their struggle was not about failure, but about the challenge of maintaining closeness when two strong individuals move forward at different speeds. This silent tension would later shape the questions, rumors, and reflections that surrounded their marriage, forcing George Clooney to confront a truth he had once believed he could avoid forever. That love, even when real, requires constant care to survive change. George Clooney's life before marriage was shaped by freedom, routine, and a carefully protected sense of independence. For decades, he was known as Hollywood's most charming bachelor, a man admired not only for his acting talent, but also for his refusal to settle down. After his early marriage to actress Talia Balsam ended in the 1990s, George openly admitted that the experience left him doubtful about love and marriage. He often joked in interviews that he was not built for commitment, turning his personal skepticism into a public identity. As his fame grew, so did the walls around his private life. While many of his closest friends married and raised families, George chose a different path. filling his days with demanding film schedules, humanitarian missions, political advocacy, and long nights of laughter with friends. From the outside, his life appeared full and exciting, a dream of wealth, success, and freedom. Yet beneath that polished surface, those closest to him noticed something quieter and harder to define. Despite his humor and confidence, there was a loneliness that followed him from city to city, from film set to villa. His large homes, filled with guests and celebration, often became silent once everyone left. Fame and success could bring applause, but they could not replace emotional connection. George himself later admitted that while he loved his freedom, there were moments when independence felt more like isolation than strength. This emotional contradiction shaped him deeply and made his later transformation all the more powerful. When Amal entered his life, it challenged everything he believed about himself. She did not fit into his world of red carpets and celebrity routines. Instead, she came from a life of discipline, intellect, and purpose, dedicated to international law and human rights. Her presence forced George to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. For the first time in years, he was not the most accomplished person in the room, and that humility changed him. Marriage did not erase his past, but it rewrote his future. He learned to share space, time, and emotional responsibility. The man who once avoided compromise now found meaning in routine, family dinners, and fatherhood. This transformation was real and visible, but it was also fragile. The habits of independence built over decades do not disappear easily. While love gave him direction, it also exposed the limits of control he once relied on. As time passed, the same independence that once protected him began to clash with the demands of marriage. His desire for quiet and reflection slowly met the reality of shared lives, shared choices, and shared sacrifices. This tension was not dramatic or explosive. It grew slowly, hidden behind smiles and public appearances. George did not stop loving his wife or family, but he began to realize that love alone does not guarantee emotional closeness. The challenge he faced was not about betrayal or conflict, but about learning how to stay emotionally present when life pulls people in different directions. This realization marked the beginning of a deeper internal struggle, one that could not be solved with charm, success, or humor.